Hello, everyone. I'm Andrew Davis, a member of the Mideast Forum of Falmouth Committee, and I'd like to welcome all of you to our 2024 session. Today's talk is Qatar-US Relations in a Changing Global Landscape, presented by Ambassador Susan Ziadeh. For those of you new to the forum, please, we are a 501(c) nonprofit organization founded in 2006. Over the course of each session, we present a series of talks that represent a wide range of perspectives and opinions addressing the complex issues facing the Middle East. Just to review the logistics for today, after our speaker's presentation, there will be time for audience Q&A. Please use the Q&A feature on your screen, not the chat function, to ask questions. Of course, questions can be submitted at any time during the session. We'll then wrap up with a few brief comments at the end and end approximately 6 o'clock. And now I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Mark Schulman, who will introduce today's speaker. Over to you, Mark.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Ambassador Susan Ziadeh. The lecture is going to focus on Qatar, which I would describe as a postage stamp of a country that many of us couldn't even find on the map until October 7th. But this country has somehow emerged as a world player, moving beyond hydrocarbons to hosting a US airbase, the World Cup, Hamas leadership, and now international negotiations. And we're fortunate to have Ambassador Ziadeh to describe and explain the manifold roles that Qatar has played historically and might play in the near future. Ambassador Ziadeh has had a very distinguished and still continuing career. She worked for 23 years with the US State Department. Most relevant for today's lecture is the 3 years that she served as the US ambassador to Qatar. But in the course of her work with the State Department, she served in at least 6 other countries in the Middle East: Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, and Israel. Ambassador Ziadeh has received numerous awards for her service, awards from the State Department. In addition, the Department of Defense awarded her the Medal for Distinguished Public Service, which is the department's highest civilian award. And Qatar awarded her the Sash of Merit. She's currently adjunct professor at Georgetown University, non-resident scholar at the Arab Gulf Institutes, and non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute, both in Washington. And she's an advisor at the American University in Beirut. And I should add, she's also a distinguished speaker at the prestigious Middle East Forum of Falmouth. But now it's time to learn about Qatar-US relations in a changing global and regional landscape. Welcome, Ambassador Ziadeh.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and my thanks to the Middle East Forum of Falmouth for this wonderful invitation. I had spoken a number of years ago to this august group, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be invited back again. My topic today is Qatar. And I must admit, when I received the email from your colleague, Alan Taylor, he listed a whole slew of questions. I said, my goodness, how can I cover all of this in 40 minutes? But I'm going to try. And in the process, I'm going to try and not only give you a little bit of the background of US-Qatar relations, but an understanding of how Qatar evolved as a country and why it has positioned itself today as a mediator and interlocutor, and where are its strengths and how it sees itself. So let's go back to about 50 years. when we had our first ambassador in Qatar in 1972. Qatar gained its independence, or it was nominally under some kind of British suzerainty until 1971, when all those countries in the Trucial Coast became more independent. Qatar is located in the Persian Gulf. It is like, it's often described as the thumb that sticks out from the Saudi Arabian peninsula. So its neighbors are Saudi Arabia to its west, Iraq much further to its north, Iran to its east. To navigate out of Qatar, you have to go down the Persian Gulf through the Straits of Hormuz and into the Indian Ocean. So it is a very critical location for many reasons, and really has been in the crossroads between Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and even in many cases, Europe. So let's take a step back and try and understand what is Qatar. Geographically, it's about the size of Connecticut. It's a small country. Its population is about 2.5 million to 3 million, depending on what you see. But its Qatari citizen population is about 300,000. The others are resident workers, from non-skilled labor to semi-skilled labor, all the way up to professional staff of people from all over the world who do work and live in Qatar. So it's a small state, and it's a small state that is surrounded by large neighbors. And the whole mentality of this small state, along with other small states in that region, is how to protect the country, how to thrive in its environment with larger neighbors. How do you become known? Many of you have said, well, we didn't even know where Qatar was before October 7th. Well, I'm going to explain to you maybe why you might have known where Qatar was known. You just didn't realize you knew it. How they've established political ties through economic ties, how they've strategized in terms of their relationships with other countries to develop strategic depth and a national security strategy. So I'm going to take you back just to the reign of the Emir of Qatar before our current Emir. The current Emir is Emir Tamim bin Hamad, who is the current Emir, who came into power in 2013 when I was ambassador. His father, Emir Hamad bin Khalifa, was the Emir starting from 1995. And I'm taking it back to this time because it's important to understand the vision of the former Emir, or as he's known in Qatar, the father Emir, and how his vision for Qatar is how it shaped the country as we know it today. He took over in 1995. This is the Emir Hamad. His father, Emir Khalifa, was the Emir. Qatar was, by all accounts, a bit of a backwater in the sense that it hadn't developed as much as some of its neighbors had. It was very closely aligned with Saudi Arabia in terms of its policies. It had started producing oil. It had some wealth, but the wealth hadn't been reinvested into the country. And in 1995, the son, Emir Hamad, decided that he was going to take over. And basically, it was a silent coup within the family, a peaceful coup, but a coup nonetheless. And he took over the country while his father was away vacationing, I believe, in Switzerland. Now, this was kind of radical for some of the neighbors. They knew the former Emir. They knew what they could count on in terms of his positions and his behavior. And this was not welcome, certainly in places like Saudi Arabia. And in 95, 96, there were certain actions that were taken. I don't know if I would call it exactly a counter coup, but at least actions taken to put the former Emir back into power. Now, this informed Emir Hamad in 1995-96 that as a small country strategically located with big neighbors, that he was vulnerable and that he had to take positions and policies to be able to safeguard Qatar as it moved forward in the 20th century, so into the 21st century. So his strategy was fourfold, and you will see now where the US plays a role in this and how it brings us into the future. So the first thing that he decided was we had to really develop the energy sector, because the energy sector was going to be the economic engine that provided the economic foundation for the state of Qatar. Now, there had been the development of the oil industry in the 1960s, 70s, even 80s, but it was still rudimentary. It was more United Kingdom, Europe-centric. The US had a very small part in this consortium. Now, where did the big change come? And this was the development of natural gas. Today, Qatar's reserves are the third largest reserves of natural gas worldwide, behind Russia and Iran. And they sit on 12% of the world's known total gas reserves. This makes them a very important player. But for them, the gas was still in the ground. Their North Field, which is in the area between Qatar and Iran. And the field is North Field for Qatar, South Pars, which is held by Iran, is the world's largest non-associated gas field. So this was an important area, and they knew that there was potential there, but they hadn't been able to develop it, and they didn't have all of the technology to be able to develop it. Initially, British Petroleum had been working with them to develop this gas field. British Petroleum put in money. After a certain point of time, they said, that's it, we're out of here, we can't put any more investment. Who happened to be there poised to jump in? Mobil of the United States, the forerunner to ExxonMobil. And Mobil and its partnership with technology from other US companies, in particular Occidental, discovered the unassociated gas and launched the industry in the early 1990s. And what is that industry? Not just the extraction of the gas, but most importantly, how to turn that gas into liquefied natural gas. So you no longer need pipelines, but you can ship the liquefied natural gas in tankers to anywhere in the world. And the process was basically how to take gas that is like this, right? It's huge. And you shrink it down to 1/60th of its size in liquid form. And then you ship it in tankers to destinations where they have regasification plants. And they take that LNG, and I'm going to use the shorthand now, the LNG, and regasify it to 60 times its amount from the LNG. Now, the US has put a lot of private investment in this sector, particularly ExxonMobil. It's a huge part of ExxonMobil's bottom line. So when you want to talk about US relations with Qatar, we have, as companies, a lot of investment in Qatar in this sector. Today, Qatar is the second largest producer of LNG. When I was ambassador, they were the first. Of course, they have now been passed by the United States, which is the #1 producer of LNG in the world. They're producing at 77 million tons a year. And they have now invested new expansions in the North Field. Well, they will now rise to 126 million tons by 2027. And last month announced further expansion to bring their total to 142 million tons by 2030. Now, why is this important? First of all, geopolitically now, with the war in Ukraine and the boycott, economic boycott of Russia and the cutoff of Russian gas supplies to Europe, Qatar has become an important swing player in terms of providing energy to Europe. Second of all, there are countries in Asia that historically have gotten energy and gas from Russia. And those countries now are looking to Qatar for more LNG to fuel their economies. Now, Qatar has long had a presence in Asia. Their first customers from the mid-90s was Japan, and they have a real place in their heart for Japan as their first customer for LNG. In fact, when the Fukushima nuclear reactor went offline in 2011, Qatar scrambled to get LNG to Japan at a time when they were badly in need of fuel. So this development was their economic linchpin, okay? So they've got the economy now in hand. The Emir looked at the second issue, self-defense and national security strategy. Now, historically, on the military side, the Qataris, again, a small country, a small force of people. You can only have so many members in the military when you have a population of 300,000. They've historically developed their military based on mostly French equipment and French training. In fact, up until about early 2012, about 80% of their equipment was French. Now, they started with some early acquisitions from the US, mostly through what we call direct commercial sales, mostly C-17s and C-130s for you folks familiar with the military. And this was mostly for humanitarian assistance. For example, when there was an earthquake in Pakistan and they wanted to rush humanitarian aid there, they used the big C-17 from the US. But in terms of their actual military, their aircraft, they have been flying Mirage, French fighter jets. And they really didn't have much of a relationship with us in terms of procurement of weapon systems and defense articles until about 2013, of course, when I was ambassador. So I'll come back to that in a minute. They were supportive of us in the Gulf War in 1991. We were positioning materiel in the fight against Saddam Hussein when he invaded in Kuwait, and Qatar was well positioned to have what we call prepo or material there to be able to have quick access. That was at an area in Qatar that would later become the basis for El Udeid. We signed a defense cooperation agreement in 1992. Most people have no idea that we've had this defense cooperation with them for over 30 years now. The Central Command, which is the component of the US military, all of our military forces that come under the command out of Fort McDill in Tampa, but it's Air Force, Army, Navy, Marines, all from Egypt all the way to Bangladesh. This is what we call the area of responsibility for Central Command. Their Air Force component deployed temporarily in 1992, a task force to Qatar during the war. And later, when we had those forces continue in Saudi Arabia for many years, in the run-up to the Iraq War in 2003, the Saudi government decided they no longer wanted to host our Air Force and our troops, particularly at Prince Sultan Air Base. And this actually was something that was told to me by one of the Qatari ambassador, who was the ambassador here in Washington at that time. He said, I got a phone call from the Pentagon, and the question was, can we move our whole operation from Saudi to El Udeid, Qatar, and how quickly can we do it? And he said, I made a call to the Emir, and the next day we got the permission. And the whole operation, including the Combined Air Operations Center, the KAOC, which is basically the eyes and ears of the whole region from Egypt all the way to Pakistan, moved to Qatar, to El Udeid in 2003. In 2009, there was a forward headquarters for AFCENT, which is the Air Force component of Central Command, is now housed at El Udeid. El Udeid Air Base in Qatar is the largest US military base in the Middle East. It is a Qatari base, but there's part of it where the US is separate and has its own base, and it's huge. And it's all of our operations in the wars that we have prosecuted in Iraq, in Afghanistan, against ISIS, against Al-Qaeda. All of the lift and Air Force components has come out of El Udeid. So it has been important in terms of our own US national security interests in the region. We also in 1911 opened CENTCOM, which again I mentioned is headquartered in Tampa. Their forward headquarters was built at El Udeid, and the four-star general who commands Central Command flies regularly into that headquarters there to conduct all of the business he does with the military in the region. So this was important to have the US military base there. It was at our request as the United States. They accommodated. And since then, the Qataris have moved more into the realm of purchases through foreign military sales from the United States. One of the most important has been the Patriot missile defense system, which they now have in Qatar, which is an American system to counter any kind of ballistic missiles that could be aimed at Qatar or anywhere in the region. They have purchased now, in 2015, F-15 fighter jets to go after any hostile forces. These are all American aircraft trained by Americans. So the security piece under the Emir Hamad, the father Emir, was secured by this. All right, point number 3, education. We've had longstanding educational ties with Qatar through something called Education City, which was developed in Qatar about 15 years ago, almost 20 years ago now. And there are 6 US college campuses in Education City in Qatar. So these are important academic ties with US institutions. We are training not just Qatari, but other nationals who live in Qatar or want to come and study in critical fields. Georgetown University has a campus there to train diplomats, Texas A&M for engineering. Anyway, there's a whole host of major US institutions that have campuses there. And the point was to train Qataris, develop closer ties with the US, and have a sense of the US education system for Qataris. The fourth pillar in the Emir Hamad's way to ensure stability in his state, and as a small state, how to protect against outside powers, was the development of the Al Jazeera TV, satellite TV network. And of course, this was the greatest tool of soft power, as the political scientist Joseph Nye has always talked about soft power as a diplomatic and economic tool. Al Jazeera started in 1995. There was a lot of money put into it. It was kind of fortuitous that BBC Arabic in London decided to shut down at that time. So there was a ready crew of trained people looking for jobs and places to land. Al Jazeera is the most watched TV satellite across the Middle East, TV station across the Middle East. We have had tensions between the US and Qatar over Al Jazeera historically, and certainly under the Bush 43, 8 years of presidency, whether it was during the Iraq War or afterwards, this was always a bone of contention in US-Qatar relations. And yet the military piece of it continued, and we certainly did house people at El Udeid, but we weren't happy about that. But interestingly enough, even during the rift between Qatar and its neighbors, which took place in 2017, we as the United States never called for any closing of Al Jazeera because we saw this as a First Amendment right issue. Part of the soft power and economic diversification, of course, was sports as soft power. And we saw this as evidenced by Qatar hosting the World Cup in 2022. It had never been done in one country that was so small. People thought it couldn't be done, particularly because of the size and the need for the infrastructure that was built. I'm proud to say that A lot of the infrastructure that was built with the help of US companies, from construction management to roads to metro stations to the stadiums. And this was an important opportunity for us as the United States to have a footprint. Economically, it created jobs and opportunities for the US. And the Qataris were actually very happy because the overall management of it was done by a US company. And it was done on time and within budget in a way that they never thought would be possible. And of course, the World Cup went off without a hitch, and it reflected very well on Qatar. For those of you who like soccer, or as in Europe and the rest of the world they call football, Qatar became known as a result of that. And of course, as part of that, Qatar Airways, which is a large airways built on a fleet, a lot of Boeing aircraft is part of their fleet. They travel to more countries in the world than just about any other airline. Maybe Turkish airline covers more, but it's a large number of places. And they crisscross the world, including about, I think, 12 cities in the United States now. So again, a way to brand themselves, a way to be known as a country and what they bring to the table. So these were the four pillars that the Emir wanted to build up. To protect themselves as a small state, to promote themselves as a small state, to develop themselves economically and politically as a small state. And of course, part of that was also how to be helpful to other nations and make themselves an indispensable partner. So we saw it economically, we saw it politically, we saw it through soft power. But they had a history of mediation. And this is something that we're even seeing today in the current troubles in the Middle East. They have mediated historically in places like Africa, in Sudan, with the troubles in Darfur, some of the border issues between Ethiopia and Eritrea. They have negotiated with non-state actors, in particular, like hostages who were in Syria. In one case, an American hostage that they helped us get out. In Yemen, as well, with getting out some hostages in Yemen. More recently, they have negotiated, I think, 3 times now with the Russians to get some Ukrainian children who were being held by the Russians as a result of the warfare, to release them. And I think within the last year, I don't think it was more than a year, we had, of course, 5 American citizens being held in Iran, and the Qataris negotiated and helped mediate the talks between us and the Iranians to get those 5 Americans released. So this has been an ongoing pattern that they have done in terms of mediation. Now, they have also had ties with groups that for us are, shall we say, inimical to US interests. And those groups could include Hamas, they could include the Taliban, and in the past, the issue has always been, do we want to engage with these groups? Is this a channel that can be used? Can Qatar mediate on our behalf to exchange messages? We know that Qatar was helpful in the development of cooperation in the early negotiations with the Taliban for our one POW who was being held by the Taliban in Afghanistan. I was ambassador at the time and was involved in those negotiations. We would not have gotten that POW out without the Qataris' help. We've had cooperation with Qatar in terms of helping us get our troops out of Afghanistan in August of 2021 when we evacuated Afghanistan. At that time, the Qataris basically had security at the airport and were critical for us to be able to get a lot of people out. Part of it were our troops and our diplomatic personnel. Part of it were the Afghans whose lives were at risk because they had worked with us in Afghanistan as translators, and we knew that the Taliban would be looking for them. The Qataris helped us with that. Many of the Afghan citizens who were evacuated from Qatar, from Kabul, directly on Qatar Airways flights to Qatar, and were being housed in Qatar in the tens of thousands for a long time before their disposition could be determined, whether it's through the IV system or whatever I should say the visa system, which would allow these people who had worked with us in Kabul and in Afghanistan to come to the United States. And there are still these Afghan, what we call SIV, special immigrant visa candidates, still in Qatar, who are being housed there while their files are being processed. All, I should say, at the hospitality of the Qataris. So they have been helpful on the Afghanistan file, and they are now, as we don't have a diplomatic mission in Kabul because of the takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban, but they are our protecting power to support our interests in Afghanistan when necessary. And that's another important role that Qatar is playing for us. Now, I want to touch on a couple of things very briefly. I'm watching the clock here, and I want to make sure to leave time for questions and answers. One of the questions that was posed to me by your group was, can you touch a little bit about Qatar's ties with Israel? And I'm happy to do so because there's a historical perspective of this that perhaps is not known. The earliest public, and I'm going to say this, many countries in the Gulf have had ties with Israel, usually through intelligence channels for quite a number of years now. They're quiet, they're sub rosa, they are tentative depending upon what is needed and what's the situation, but they have been there for quite a number of years. But the earliest public evidence of Doha's ties with Israel was in 1996, when Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres visited Doha. That's a long time ago. People aren't aware of that. And in fact, in 1996, Qatar established an Israeli trade office in Doha. Now, they did not have diplomatic ties. It was not any kind of formal diplomatic presence, but it was a trade office, and it was there for whatever purposes were to be gained on the issue of trade. And it remained open despite regional tensions until 2008. In 2008, Israel had carried out its Operation Cast Lead in Gaza. And that was, I guess, more than the traffic could bear domestically, politically in Qatar. And the Israeli trade office was closed. But it was open for that 8-year period. Today, I mean, Israelis can visit Doha. They can visit on their regular passport. Qatar has hosted many kind of worldwide sporting events. Israelis can come and attend those events or participate as participants in the events. But more importantly, they have had relations and coordinations with Israel on the question of assistance to the Palestinians in Gaza. And this is more well known, particularly for things like fuel to power electric grids, public salaries for individuals, building of apartment buildings, schools, and other infrastructure. They had one point person who was an engineer, Mohammed Al-Imadi. His role was to oversee the dispensation of the funds. All of this was done in coordination and through the Israeli government in Israel. And in fact, this was the way that Mohammed Al-Imadi would go to Jordan, cross over into Israel, meet with the Israelis, and funds, etc., was all done through Israeli banks, so that there was full transparency on this issue. Now, of course, this was a way that the Qataris also developed more ties with the officials who were running Gaza, which of course was Hamas, but it wasn't specifically for Hamas. Funds were not given for Hamas. It was for the infrastructure and particularly the electric power grids, because fuel often was running out and they had to rush funds. Even when I was ambassador, it's like the SOS call, we've got fuel for 2 more days and the bakeries are going to have to shut down. There's not going to be any bread. So the Qataris did this on the basis of quote unquote for the Palestinian people, but of course, who was in charge of Gaza? It was Hamas. So how you parse that, how you look at it is open to interpretation, and I don't have any more visibility than anybody else on that. And the last thing I want to talk about a little bit is relations with Iran, because that often comes up. You know, as I mentioned before, they have historically had relations with Iran because they share a gas field. That gas field, the North Field, South Pars, are one big field, but they have a demarcation line. Actually, the Iranians have not produced that much from South Pars because of economic sanctions. The North Field has been more developed by the Qataris. It's separate. The production is separate. There's no joint production and no joint ownership. And in fact, you know, the Qataris and the Iranians do see each other as competitors within the gas market in terms of market share and price. So because of geography and because of hydrocarbons, they have to have relations with Iran, and they have. But I remember from the early 2010s, they didn't have strong economic ties. There wasn't a lot of trade. I think one bank had corresponding relations with an Iranian bank, but that was pretty much it. The change came when the rift occurred in 2017. And just briefly, the rift was when Qatar was blockaded from the north by Bahrain, to the east, to the west by Saudi Arabia, and to the south by the United Arab Emirates. They were blockaded economically, their borders were closed, their airspace was closed, and their waterways were closed. They were basically closed in, and they had nowhere to go. And critically, how do you get your LNG out? How do you get food in to feed your people? How do you fly your aircraft when you can't go over the airspace that has been blocked? In this instance, Iran really came to their rescue. The only way out of Qatar in the years between 2017 and 2021 was through Iranian airspace. And I remember being on a plane, and you know how when you're on the aircraft, they show you the map and exactly where the aircraft is. And instead of going up the coast of the Persian Gulf on the west side, let's say Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and up, no, we went airspace to the east, to Iran, and then traveled up the Iranian coast until we got into Iraqi territory. So this, if it hadn't been for that, Qatar Air would have had a real difficult time. Also ports, no food was coming in from the ports across the border from Saudi Arabia, ports out of the UAE like Jebel Ali, all of that was cut off. So the trans-Gulf movement of ships from Iran, even if the goods weren't coming from Iran, they could be coming from Azerbaijan or from Turkey or anywhere else, through Iran across the Gulf to Doha. So Iran was kind of critical during this period in helping them survive during the blockade. And with the lifting of the blockade in 2021, of course, now they can fly their aircraft, the trade has been resumed, etc. But the Qataris still do remember who came to their rescue during that difficult time. And the relations with Iran during that period were particularly important and continue till today. So I've done 40 minutes. I think we're ready for questions.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd rate that as a tour de force. Fact-filled, information-filled, and insightful. Really good. Thank you. We do have questions, and let me just see where to. So the hydrocarbon business is still their major economic engine.
Yes.
And considering the serious problem of global warming, climate change, Does the government have plans to cut back, to substitute some other basis for economics?
Yeah, they have a development plan, which they call Vision 2030. And in that plan, there are a number of components. First of all, if we look at the hydrocarbons, and in particularly natural gas and LNG, it's still projected even by the International Energy Agency in the United States that gas will be a very important component moving forward. Some people have called it the transition, the transition energy product. Others have said that gas will continue for the foreseeable future, maybe even the next 50 years. In particular, because you have such large growing economies and growing populations, more importantly, in places like Asia. So the Qataris have increased their production because they see that there's going to be a demand. At the same time, they realize their economy can't be dependent upon something whereby the demand could diminish over time. So they've tried to expand their reach through a number of ways to broaden their economy, whether it's through hosting of sporting events, IT, developing different industries that move away from education, healthcare, regional hub on other kinds of entertainment in ways that will tourism and trade. Now they have ships docking in Doha because they have a new port to be able to promote tourism, to be able to expand their economy in ways that lessens the percentage of the economy that's dependent solely on LNG.
Thank you. Another question is, could you explain the relationship between the royal family and the Muslim Brotherhood, if there is such a relationship?
Yeah, I don't know if I would say there's such a relationship. I would say that Qatar historically, or at least under certainly the father Emir, and probably also under this Emir, but maybe a little less so, I can't speak for them, I'm not sure, have always looked at political Islam as a component of political life in the Middle East. And that's not to say whether they support it or not, but they see it as an important element that will continue for the foreseeable future. Now, certainly in the Arab Spring, when many countries were experiencing turmoil and certain leaders came to power, whether it was in Tunisia or in Egypt, and the threat to Bashar al-Assad in Syria by groups, some of which had Islamist leanings, the Qataris were supportive of these elements because they felt it represent the people, but also because they felt that political Islam has a role to play, and these individuals, these people, were supporting this vision of what the region could become, no longer dominated simply by autocratic leaders. So they have established that. They probably have a vision in the same way that Erdogan of Turkey does, similarly, and they have strong political ties with Turkey under Erdogan. But they also have supported other governments that are not inclined to the Muslim Brotherhood. They've supported Egypt under the 1 year or 2 years of rule under the Muslim Brotherhood. They've also sent support to Egypt before that time under Tantawi, when Mubarak was overthrown under the Tantawi regime, and they have sent assistance to Sisi, who is currently the president. So it's not an either or. It's looking at political parties across the region and basically hedging your bets. They support across the board. That's always been their kind of, again, as a small state, how do you protect yourself? You have a finger in every pie.
Thank you. You spoke briefly about the blockade that was imposed on Qatar.
Mm-hmm.
What was the dispute about? How was it resolved?
Well, to my mind, the dispute was really, and this is how the Qataris look at it, whether you have sovereignty over your country or not. That's how the Qataris see it. In other words, why should other countries interfere in our internal decisions and our internal policy and external policies? To the other countries, which are part of the GCC, not all, the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is an amalgam of the 6 GCC countries, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. To some of these countries, like Kuwait and Oman, both small states, they agreed that there shouldn't be any external interference from the other brothers of the GCC in their internal and external policies. To the Saudis and to the Emiratis and to the Bahrainis for different reasons, but in general, they had a list of a number of things. Number one being Al Jazeera. They didn't like it. They didn't like it as a platform. They didn't like what they had to say. They felt, they saw it as a threat of some sort. They didn't like some of the Qatari position. What they say was supportive of political Islamists. I mean, there's a whole laundry list of issues that they felt, well, the Qataris shouldn't be allowed to do this. Well, so they see themselves as the big brother and the dominant force, and the Qataris, as a small nation, said, no, this is our country. We do what we want to do. We have our sovereignty. And just as we don't interfere in yours, you shouldn't interfere in ours. So it was a total difference of opinion. Now, when they embargoed, the first few days were tough in Qatar. But Qatar figured out how to ride out the storm through devising new trade routes, new relationships, new sources of food, diplomatic engagement, etc. And after 4 years, basically, the Saudis met in El Ola with and invited the Qataris along with other members of the GCC, and they said, "Okay, it's done. It's lifted. The embargo is lifted." But actually, not much was addressed. I think they realized that the attempt was not productive. It created rifts not only in the GCC, but tensions in relationships, let's say, with Saudi Arabia and the United States, or the UAE and the United States. Don't forget what a large platform we have in Qatar. And, you know, our Secretary of Defense at the time was Jim Mattis. Mattis used to be the head of Central Command when I was ambassador, and he'd come into Qatar all the time. He knew how important that base was. And for many people who are very supportive of our government politically, to have LNG being cut off to countries that are allies of the United States does not sit well with a lot of people. So in the end, I think smarter heads prevailed, and the rift was, shall we say, at least papered over for the moment. So let's hope it holds.
So I have a question about the military. What kind of a military establishment does Qatar have? Do they use guest workers in that? And I mean, a related question, came in about, you were speaking before about Qatar supporting military operations against Assad. How much of that was coming from Qatar?
Well, Qatar has, repeat the beginning of that again, I'm sorry.
The question really was, what is Qatar's own military? Do they use guest workers in it?
Yeah, Qatar's military is small, but it is mostly Qatari. There are some people, like, say, in the local police force at a certain level who are citizens from other neighboring countries, usually Muslim countries, because they don't have enough people. But in terms of their military, no, they are Qataris. Now, when you talk about on the base, where you have workers who are doing certain elements to support the base from a structural perspective, then yes, you would have non-Qatari workers. And certainly as the base has been expanded, at the expense of the Qataris. You have had foreign workforces working, whether it's engineers or actual work people doing the construction. Like any, the construction companies hire local people, and they also hire workers from outside who are looking to earn a living, both.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned early on that the native population of Qatar was only 300,000 people. I mean, it's easy to understand how they're a country now, but why were they not gobbled up long ago by Saudi Arabia?
Well, they were created in the aftermath of the British leaving in 1970, 71. And at the time, there were discussions about whether, for example, the trucial states, which basically make up what we know as the United Arab Emirates, although not exclusively, whether all those states should be housed as one area. Bahrain opted to be independent, and Qatar also opted to be independent, both of which with their royal families that had been established for about 200 years. And they weren't keen to be part of a conglomerate of states that would be ruled by the Al Nahyan, the royal family of the United Arab Emirates. The Emirates has 7 of these entities that have bound together into the United Arab Emirates, but Qatar did not want to be one of them. I think in terms of borders throughout the GCC countries is always a controversial issue. Many borders have only been established in the last few years, definitively, legally registered. And some probably are still under contention, whereby maybe they were solved in the past, but now they could come into the fore again because of, let's say, oil deposits or need for land for strategic depth purposes. But in general, those borders have been respected. It's more the spheres of influence and how you shape the policy or influence the policy of a country to go along with your vision or what you want. That's where some of the tensions have come in, where the countries have had, as any country would, different national security interests and national economic interests, and sometimes competing. And you've seen that with Qatar, with its neighbors, but you've also seen that between any GCC country and its neighbor. It's just a common pattern of how these countries have this kind of modus vivendi, how they manage to get along, but still have competing interests that they try to influence and shape.
Okay. So we have time for one more question, and it's a question on Hamas.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned earlier how Qatar has provided large sums to Hamas for various things. So the question is actually...
I didn't say that.
I thought... Okay.
No, I said that provided monies for infrastructure development. Yes. That has been overseen by a Qatari official with the cooperation and knowledge of the Israelis. That is what I said.
Yeah, I'm not sure I see the difference, but...
that's fine, because Hamas...
Yeah. Anyway, so the question actually has more to do with the U.S.
Yeah.
Was the U.S. aware of this? And if so, was there the question actually is about the contrast between Qatar's providing funds and the way the U.S. prosecuted individuals for providing funds to Hamas. I sort of butchered the question, but
no, I'm understanding. Look, Qatar has provided funds for Palestinians for a long time, and we have asked them to continue that. In part, they did it through the Arab League. The Arab League Summit would say each country that has the ability, we should provide a certain amount of money, usually to the Palestinian Authority, but sometimes it could go elsewhere. All right. Now, after a certain period of time in 2007, 2008, when elections took place and in Gaza, Hamas won. It became a problem for us as the United States. We could no longer say we're going to provide funds to Gaza because of Hamas, although we did provide funds through NGOs to do humanitarian assistance and development work and education in Gaza, but not directly to the Hamas government in the same way we would potentially give assistance to the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, okay? So at this point then, you have officials who don't have a budget. They don't have ways of paying for their people. You don't have infrastructure being developed, and you don't even have money for fuel to run electrical grids. The emir, the father, who was emir at the time, went to Gaza for the first time in 2012. I remember, again, I was ambassador. And this was the first time he made a visit, and he pledged at the time 400 million for assistance to Gaza, mostly for infrastructure, and that the infrastructure would be built and financed by Qatar, but overseen by the Qatari officials there on the ground, and with the knowledge of Israel, and in fact, funds often going through Israel. But the power in charge in Gaza was Hamas. Yes.
I think that does clarify it. Thank you.
Yes, of course.
All right, I'm gonna thank you again. And I'm gonna pass the microphone back to Andrew for a few last remarks. So thank you very much. It was really a great talk.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you, Ambassador Ziadeh, for being with us today and for providing, as Mark described it, a tour de force of the history and motivations between the US and Qatar for quite a long time. I think I think many of us have learned, due to your depth and precision and your knowledge of how deep and how deep the relationship is and how long it has been in existence. What I'd like to do now is talk to the audience for about 30 seconds about what's coming up. We hope that you'll be able to join us actually a week from today, when we will have our second speaker, and I'm going to bring up his slide. It's Benham Ben Talabou, who is a senior fellow in the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He'll be talking about Iran, specifically from where do we go from here in assessing Iran's, assessing Iran's role in the new Middle East. The session next week will be at 5 o'clock, the same as it was today. In addition, I'd like to just mention something about the Mideast Forum of Falmouth. We have a website, which you can see on the screen. You can go there and learn more about who we are and what we do. But basically, we provide free open lectures, and we have been doing so since 2006. We are a 501(c)(3) organization. We are run by volunteers. It's 100% volunteer run, and it's funded by contributions from viewers like you. And if you'd like to provide us some feedback, the website there is infomef.world@gmail.com. With that, I will bring today's webinar to a close. Thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you next week when we will be talking about Iran. Have a great day.